Serious, what stories about WW2 did your grandparents tell you, and or what did you find out about their lives during that period? Something sweet. My grandparents saved *ALL* their love letters sent back and forth during that time. They had just met and had fallen in love before his departure. So they carried on their romance and developed the relationship through beautifully written letters. Those letters expressed every emotion, from the realities and horrors of war to the abiding hope they'd be reunited safe and sound. They were married not long after grandfather's return. My grandfather was pretty rich from real estate in the coastal province of Zhejiang in China until the Japanese invaded. He and his family relocated to the inland wartime capital and worked as a telegraph operator for the war. The Japanese took everything from everyone back then, and nothing was the same afterwards. Coupled with a civil war right after, and things were pretty ****tty. My granduncle was part of a cleanup crew in Japan after the Battle of Leyte. So after all the fighting was done, Theed sent his unit in to clear out the bodies of the fallen Japanese. He said that they would loot their bodies, take treasures like knives, swords, gold off the teeth, and then put their bodies on a giant landing craft, the kind that open up on a beach, and take them out to sea to dispose of them. He says he'll never forget watching the sharks just go to town on the dead. Haunts him to this day. Edit. This was in Philippines, not Japan. But it was a battle against the Japanese. Another edit. The intention was to give them a sea burial, since the Japanese left their dead upon retreat. It wasn't meant to desecrate the deceased further. My grandpa very rarely talked about it, but he was in the Pacific in WW2. He caught malaria and was sent to a hospital ship to recover, and the Japanese sunk the ship. So he floated for like 10 hours clinging to the wreckage with active malaria before finally being rescued. And after all that, he re-enlisted and fought in the Korean War also. He never said much, but he did talk once about throwing explosives of some kind in a river to catch fish. He was in the South Pacific as a Marine. I just remembered another one. He did not smoke, so he traded his cigarettes till he had enough for a typewriter, so he could type his letters to his wife and my mom, his daughter, who was born after he went to war. My grandfather joined up in 1943 when he turned 18 years old. He was stationed on a Pacific island where he basically became a radar orderly. His family were Mennonites, so he was a conscientious objector. He was a medic, clerical worker, cook, ditch digger, driver, and anything else that he was asked. Most of his time was spent cleaning up after everyone else and watching for air raids by the Japanese Air Force. Edit. My mom said that he watched the Japanese planes surrender on the Missouri. My grandfather befriended a German family during the war. They would cook him meals, and the mother would wash his clothes. One day he loaded up a box with eggs and used toilet paper to make sure they didn't break. The next day there was a note in his laundry thanking him for the eggs, but an even bigger thank you for the toilet paper. They hadn't had any in years. Grandfather was drafted, broke his femur in basic training. Spent the entirety of WWII behind a desk in Oklahoma processing logistics and supply chain management requests. My grandfather would talk about the training time with his unit while being transported, but mostly about a little kid he was helping feed in China after Japan surrendering. He would just think aloud about what happened to him and if he was alright. He never talked about combat. I did walk into his house once, and the History Channel was on showing a USMC graveyard on Okinawa, and he was crying. My grandfather lost his twin and his mother in a German bombing raid during the Blitz. He was 15 at the time and an alcoholic for most of his adult life. My great aunt told me she and her friends used to play in the bombed ruins of buildings near their home in West London. In retrospect, she realized how dangerous it was to be 3 stories up a crumbling building, but at the time, they didn't care at all. My grandpa stormed the beaches at Pointe du Hoc in Normandy and lived to tell about it. Afterwards, when things calmed down and they had left France, he ran off for about a week to another country and had some fun. I went back to Pointe du Hoc with him for a Rangers reunion with my family several years ago. Now that was powerful. Standing in the same area with your grandpa and family where he stormed the beaches. Grandpa and grandma were out in Austria. Grandma was super pregnant with my aunt. They were stumbling through the forest when they met 5 Afro-American soldiers. Might have been the first time they've seen black people. One asked Grandpappy to come closer. No common language, just by using hand signs. They both thought that that's the end. They're done. It's scary to run into guys with big guns in the forest. Turns out, they got a bunch of eggs in exchange for some help at a nearby farm. And when they saw grandma's big belly, they thought she'll be needing the extra calories more than them. So they put it all into Pa's hat and pointed on grandma, smiling. Best dudes ever. My great grandfather never talked about the war until he had his stroke. We knew he had a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star, but we didn't know how he got them. He was just a private, and he'd had enough of the military when the war was over. After the stroke, he seemed to loosen up. He laughed about sighting rifles in by shooting at chickens. He showed us pictures of him in front of the Eiffel Tower. Turns out he was occupation force. Ended up occupying an area near Berlin that became involved in the Battle of the Bulge. Apparently, while he was fighting, some sort of explosive blew off his buddy's leg. So grandpa did what anyone else would do and threw his buddy over his shoulder to get him to the med tent. This included running across a field in the line of sight of a German machine gun nest. He was shot in the leg and some more shrapnel ended up in his chest. Somehow grandpa and his buddy survived. We thought he was embellishing it, but the Bronze Star paperwork included a report that we found after he passed away. 2 higher-ups signed that the story was true, so I guess I have to believe it. He told us it wasn't that big of a deal, and that he didn't deserve all those medals for what he did. What'll about us? R.I.P. Gramps. Edit. Words edit 2. People are pointing out that this battle didn't happen in Berlin. He never said Berlin, just Germany. I said Berlin, because I'm not good at history. Sorry. My grandpa went to Annapolis during the war and ended playing piano for the USO. It might not be badass, but it's still kind of cool. Got 2 stories. Grandmother on my mom's side told me this story. I remember first time when the Germans came into my village. I was outside playing with my cousin when my mom came and pulled us into the house and said, "SSH, be silent, the Germans are here." We stood by the window that had a little opening and saw how German soldiers walked on the road with tanks and knocked on people's doors and pulled some of them out. I saw my neighbor get shot on the spot. I was 5 years old and still remember it clearly. Grandmother on my dad's side, we lived just by the Danube, and I remember seeing the Germans on the other side of the stream. They started to board some small boats to cross the river. After some minimum they started to shell and shoot towards us, and I took my little brother in my arms and started to run for my life. I was 9 years old and my brother 4. They didn't care how we looked like or not. They hated us because we are Slavs and not Germans. My grandmother on dad's side was redhead, Irish redhead. My grandmother on mom's side was blonde and green/blue eyes. 2 stories that stuck the most. Pacific Theater, Southeast Asia. Japanese occupation. Granddad was a small boy. At the beginning of the occupation, he didn't know he has to bow to any soldiers he passes. The only thing my grandpa ever said about the war was how he made his engagement ring out of a quarter using a tablespoon. I assume he saw some S***T. I did however meet an artsy airplane mechanic. 90 years old and dude still had all his wits about him. My grandfather served on a destroyer for the US and saw action in the Pacific Theater in Korea. One story I vividly remember is him telling me they had to assist in recovering downed US pilots from the ocean. He said many times the pilots were already dead and had been mutilated by sharks. He said he would never forget pulling those men out of the water. My father was a medic in WW2 and was part of the Normandy invasion, where he had to do what he could with pieces of soldiers. It must have been horrifying. On his deathbed he admitted that he stole 2 small bars of silver from the body of a German soldier somewhere in France. He wasn't proud of it, and in fact he was quite ashamed of his actions even 60+ years later. When he returned home he sold the silver, and in a small way it helped him purchase a small trailer in which he and my mom lived while he finished college. My great grandfather died in the Netherlands fighting when my grandpa was 1 year old. My great-grandmother never spoke about it even up until she died, and it was only cleaning the house my grandpa found the Purple Heart and other memorabilia tucked away. She never remarried. Recently my dad and I went to the Netherlands and got the chance to visit the American cemetery there to see where he was buried. It was touching and sad. My dad had never met his grandpa and his dad could never make it over there at this point. We rubbed sand into his name on the gravestone and planted flags, talked about him. He died in 1945. My grandfather, a 6'6" red-headed Irishman from New York, was a lieutenant in charge of an anti-aircraft battery at Normandy. That's not the interesting bit though. As the Allies advanced into Europe they took a number of prisoners, who all spoke German. Obviously, my lieutenant grandfather was put into a private's uniform and stationed outside the POW camp. Why? Because my 6'6" red-headed Irishman from New York grandfather was the son of a German immigrant and spoke fluent German. He got a lot of intel from the prisoners who spoke German freely in front of the American. Light-hearted story. My grandpa was an MP, military police. When the soldiers got in bar fights and they needed to call the MP, he would get sent out to break it up, load them into the jeep, and take them back to base. He said they would drop them off at the gate. If they were sober enough to walk back to barracks on their own, they were free to go. If they were too drunk they would have to take them to the brigadier. These soldiers were under a lot of stress. I think it's a pretty cool thing that he bent the rules for some of these guys. My grandmother was a Jew in a Nazi concentration camp. She was pretty much certain to die because she didn't have a job and she wasn't cunning enough to survive on her own. It was rough. One day some local farmers in Russia bought her to work for them during the day. So she would go to the farm to work during the day and come back at night. The farmers would feed her and clothe her. They also helped her sneak food into the camp. Often, I don't know how, she would sneak soups into the camp to give to her friends and family. The farmers were endless in their kindness and helped her survive until the Nazis were defeated and everyone was released. My grandmother was reunited with her family and lived a long life until she died last year. Without the farmers' kindness I don't think I would be here today. My grandmother was in Auschwitz, so nothing good. She and her oldest sister moved from Lithuania to Poland under fake identities, but were later arrested and identified when her sister and her husband were caught forging documents for French prisoners of war and a friend sold them all out. She went into the camps a young woman with 2 parents, 4 grandparents and 6 siblings, and left with virtually no living relatives. I was just talking to my grandmother recently, she's alive and in her 90s, about her grandfather who was a high-ranking member of some military or another, and was under a lot of pressure at one point to essentially change his last name to something not Jewish sounding, and convert himself and his family to Christianity, in order to continue his peaceful and prosperous existence. But he refused. Not really thinking about it, I said imagine how much trouble it might have saved you if he had. She's Jewish on both sides of her family, so I don't know how that would have worked exactly, but again I wasn't really thinking about my words. And she laughed a bit and said I don't think so. In Russian there's an expression, and then she paused a moment, as if considering how to translate it, and said you get punched in the face, not the passport. My great-grandfather commanded a battery stationed in France for a period of time. They were tipped off about a German supply train that would be passing through the area. They ambushed the train and captured 150 German soldiers, injured 30, killing 25 in the fight. Some tanks and other equipment was destroyed or taken. All members received a Bronze Star and my great-grandfather also received the Kreuzstiege, awarded to those soldiers who distinguish themselves by acts of heroism involving combat with the enemy. You know, now that I think about it, I don't remember my grandma ever telling me about WW2 and her life through it. I know my dad was born a year after, so she must have done some celebrating when it ended. Lol edit. My dad was born 6 months after the war ended. My grandmother didn't like to talk about the war. She lost several brothers. To this day we don't know where exactly 2 of them are buried. She told me that life was pretty much normal, especially in the first years, and continued to be normal until the bombings started. She lived in west of Germany, a small town. Farm life has to go on, war or no war. She did tell small things though. For example, she saw a friend of her pick up a grenade, not knowing what it was. The girl lost both hands. Or how they hid in the woods when the sirens for air bombings started. The first black person she saw was a Tommy. Most of them were friendly and asked for water or some potatoes when they arrived. Came though her town. She was afraid though, the Germans had lost. After all, the soldiers carried guns. Stories about the brutality of the Russians had reached her, and they didn't understand each other due to the language barrier. My grandmother was born in 1938, so she was young, 7 years old, when the war ended. She told me she remembers being scared to death when there were blackout drills, even if the Germans were going to bomb the US. Her small town in North Carolina would have never been a target, but I can see that a young child wouldn't really understand that, and she remembers her mother telling them that the war was over. She said she was excited because that meant they could get tires for their bicycle if they had a bike, but no tires for it since so much rubber was being used for the war effort. My great-granddad was, along with his soldier mates, captured by the Germans in North Africa. He was German-born himself, but his family emigrated to Britain in the early 30s, so he could converse with his captors. The German guards had to leave the area, I think he said cave, they were detained in, because an alarm went off, and so my great-granddad and the others ran out and stole a car, making it back to friendly lines lol. My grandparents were 8 and 5 when the Japanese attacked Nanjing. My grandpa told me he remembers his dad taking him and his mom running away 2 days before the rape happened. My grandma's family was pretty well off. They owned a few restaurants in Nanjing. Her family had to basically give up everything to not get raped or killed. My granddad was a baby and his mother was walking with him down the street when a Messerschmitt 109 came flying down, opening fire down the street. A butcher dragged them both into his shop for cover and they survived, apparently. One of my grandfathers, German but not Nazi, told me about the time he and his family was hiding in the basement of a building in Leipzig, Ger. American planes were flying over the city, and he was the one looking up the chimney, and every time he heard the sound of bombs dropping he shouted, "Run to da kommt noch ein. Get down, another one is coming." He is still alive, and I love to listen to WW2 stories firsthand. These memories are so expensive. My grandfather, Polish, was only about 12 when Poland was invaded by Nazi Germany. He was from a poor small farming village where most of his family lived and worked. At the end of the war, he moved to Dachau and signed up to be a guard at the Dachau concentration camp under orders from the US Army. The Dachau concentration camp after the war held all the Nazi SS and other war criminals who were awaiting trial, so I'm sure he experienced some inhumane things being done there, but he never spoke about it. I recently received my Polish passport, and in doing so had to dig up a lot of old photos and information about him. The only thing I could read in English was his enlisting documents at Dachau by the US Army, accompanied by a photo of him in the uniform. It's a great photo. My grandmother, German, was from a wealthy family and lived in a town near the Czech border. Her uncle was a lawyer for one of the Communist Party members and was taken away and never seen again. After the war, all of their land, possessions, and properties were given to the Czechs and they were told they could only take with them what they could carry. My grandmother left for Munich to find work. Dachau is near Munich. My grandparents met, fell in love, and after a couple years, got married and moved all the way to Australia with no money or possessions, something they would probably use to buy now. There they moved in with a family, where my grandma did housework for keep, and my grandfather went around collecting scrap metal to sell. He ended up building a very successful business from this, that has provided for their children and grandchildren. I'm very proud of them. My grandfather passed away in 2014 and my grandmother passed away in March this year. They had a long and happy life. I don't know the details very well, so I'll let more knowledgeable war historians fill in the blanks for me. My grandfather was a random farmhand in central France, about 20 when the French government surrendered. A couple years later, he joined the resistance, not knowing how long the war was going to last. Turns out he joined at the end of 1943, so it was only a few months later that the US Army ended up winning the French territories back. When the US forces arrived near my grandpa's countryside, his Maquis resistance group essentially offered their services as scouts/reconnaissance, since they didn't have much firepower, but they were quite good at sneaking around. They ended up making their way through eastern France and into Germany, liberating various small towns on the way, although my understanding is that the Wehrmacht was essentially fleeing at this point. Enter the small town of Anweiler in Germany. My grandpa is making a reconnaissance round when he hears a patrol coming around and has to hide quickly. He knocked on a random door and asked in broken German to be hidden inside. Versteck mich. They accepted, and in that house, my grandpa met the daughter of the family, just 3 years younger than him. Her name was Anna. They kept in touch, and he came back with his hat in his hands a couple years later and asked for her hand. They settled in Lorraine, a region that historically got passed around between France and Prussia/Germany, and where a French-German couple would not be judged quite as harshly. 60 years of marriage, 6 children, and a gaggle of grandkids and great-grandkids later, they passed away a few months apart from each other. They are buried in the tiny graveyard of the church of the village, where I grew up. Make sure to like and subscribe for more daily content. Thanks for watching.